Once you've got it installed, the easiest way to create a new IFC file is, I think right now you can just press File, Export IFC, and you can call it test.ifc, and you click Export, and you're done. And this cube is now exported into an IFC file. You'll notice that by default, it's actually created a structure on the right here. And it does that by default if it detects that you haven't set up a project. So IFCs are a little bit different to other file formats in that they don't just store your 3D geometry. They store a whole set of semantics and structure about how a building works. For example, how many buildings there are, whether it's in a site, how many levels or stories are in a building, how many rooms there are in that story, and how many objects are in that room. And in fact, the ability to store geometry is optional. It's not a requirement. So it's perfectly valid to have an IFC file that contains no geometry whatsoever, but an incredibly rich set of data. So in that sense, it's actually more important to export the data than the geometry itself when it comes to IFC. And it is mandatory to include what's called a spatial structure. And the simplest spatial structure, or the most common spatial structure, not the simplest, is having a project. Every IFC project, every IFC file must have a project, followed by a site inside of it, a building inside the site, and a building story inside the building. The project is mandatory, the rest are not. They can change, but this is a very common setup, so that's what it does by default. So these are regular Blender collections. I could have equally well just clicked, new collection and typed in IFC project, my new project, and that's equally valid. You don't actually need to have it generated for you, but it's just faster, just for convenience. And so it's detected that our cube is not belonging to any particular object, so it's labeled it an IFC building element proxy object and put it in the ground floor of our building. So let's create a brand new file now, and I'm going to delete everything in this file. Everything's gone, and I'm going to import. I think I called it test. Yes, and you can see that I have imported the cube that was in my IFC file, and the structure has been retained. You'll also notice that this cube has an ID associated with it and a name, and we'll go through that in a bit of detail later on, but it just shows you that there's various bits of metadata associated with each object, and that's where the power of IFC comes in. It's not so much just the geometry, but it's all this data, which you can then use to, if you're designing a bigger building, create schedules for windows and doors and wall types and so on. So you'll also notice there are some objects related to the ground floor and the building and the site. They can also have various types of attributes associated with them. They also have a location in space, so I can move it, and they're represented by a Blender empty object. And that's, for example, if the ground floor is actually not at 0, 0, 0, and it's, let's say, elevated by 1 meter up in the air, I can, or let's say 2 meters so I can see it, I just move it up in the z-axis by 2, and now my ground floor is up by 2. If I wanted to move everything in the ground floor, I can just select all objects like that within that floor and move it up by 2. And now my cube is up by 2, my floor is up by 2, but the building and the site remains at 0.